Really. I'm not lying. I really don't say this about all the speakers. In my SBS, really, in my SBS, Sean Ellis was my favorite speaker. He really was. He spoke on Revelation, and it blew my mind. It was so good. Anyway, Sean is with us this week. Sean Ellis. It's just you. Your family's not here, right? Just you. He just got done teaching a week in Honolulu. He was out there with the SBS, and then he's here with us for the next week. And Sean has been in missions for almost 20 years, mostly with YWAM, right? He led a number of SBSs here. He also led SBSs in Montana, and then moved out to Taiwan. So him and his family live out in Taiwan, and you're a teaching pastor at a local church. And it's a bilingual church, so it's Mandarin and English. And so you're the main English pastor of that church. And so I'm sure you'll probably talk a little bit more about what you do, but we're so blessed to have him come all the way from Taiwan to be with us this week. It really is going to be amazing. So I hope that you guys are expectant for what God wants to do this week. I truly believe it's going to be the best week of DBS yet, honestly. So hope you guys are ready. Can we get whoever prayed last time to pick a new... Is it Margot? Margot, do you want to pass on the... Oh, you just picked Margot. Margot, come on up. Margot, everyone. Come on.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this beautiful day and this opportunity to really learn more of your word and more of just what you want to teach us. And I thank you for Sean. I thank you for allowing him to be here with us. And I just pray that we stay focused and just stay positive. And so just speak through him today and help us all just have a really good time. We love you. I pray all these things in your name. Amen.
Well, for me, I think the microphone's definitely on. For me, being back in Kona is a place of births, lots of different births. It was a real place of spiritual rebirth for me, 1994. Don't tell me if you were born or not or how old you were. 1994, I did my DTS up at King's Mansion when they were still running schools up there. And I'll share a little bit of my background as we go throughout this week. But it was not good where I was at after graduating from university, and God really just grabbed a hold of my heart in a very, very special way with His grace during my DTS. Amazing turnaround in my life, and began to pursue His call for my life for missions. I met my wife here on the island, so the birth of love, and we got married about a year later, and another significant birth were 4 births of all my children. We came back and we began to staff in 1995. My wife had already been DTS staff previously, so we started staffing the SBS, did the SBS, and then started staffing. All 4 of our kids were born here up in the Kealakekua Hospital. When our first was born, Sophia, I'll show you a little picture of the fam. Sophia, our oldest, was born. She's actually graduating from high school this year. So she was born right before one of my first SBS teachings. I was supposed to teach Exodus, and I overslept, like radically overslept. You know, you just wake up, one of those nightmare situations, didn't shave, didn't shower, ran down in the classroom because we were up most of the night with her. But yeah, she's graduating from high school this year. When she was born up at the Kealakekua Hospital, this will really date us. The birthing room that they had was just ancient. It was so old, they literally had an 8-track player. Now, let me just describe, before we had iPods and downloadable music, we had these things called CDs, and before we had CDs, we had these things called tape cassettes, and before we had tape cassettes, we had something called an 8-track. Because there were literally only 8 songs that could fit on it, and you just had 8 buttons on your stereo players, like chick, 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 chick. That's an 8-track. All right, so hopefully they've remodeled a little bit in that time. And really it was a place where God birthed a hunger, a desire, a passion for God's Word. And that really has not stopped 20 years later. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of missions. We've celebrated both of those 20th anniversaries. And I was saying this to the SBS last week. I don't regret any of it. There's not a day that I've given to Jesus, a day that I've given to my wife in marriage that I regret. In fact, I just regret that I didn't start earlier, that I wasted all my university years just following the wrong things. So a little bit more BRI background information. Important down there in the bottom, total Bible nerd. I can come to grips and confess that Bible nerdiness. As well, I do still do some traveling teaching in different places in YWAM, but my main thing now is we're working with a bilingual church plant in the city of Taichung, Taiwan, and talk a little bit more about that as we go. So 20 years. Some things have changed, not just with technology, but obviously with the way that we perceive the world. We're talking about the Great Commission, and a question, of course, I'd have to ask myself is, from when we started in missions in 1994 until today, in those 20 years, how has missions changed? How have we done? How have we progressed? Are we being successful in carrying out the call that God has for us as the church? Well, when you look at a map, you could look at it and think optimistically. This map, you can see pretty much everything that's in the purple and in the blue and kind of that weird color at the top, magenta, I'm not sure what that is. Those are all Christianized areas, right? Places where there is a Christian majority, where the gospel is firmly planted. There are churches, there are seminaries, Bible schools, and it's been there for a long time. And so when you just look at that, you think, wow, that's not too bad. If you look at North and South America, you look at Africa, you look at the top part of Asia, you look at Australia. However, if you look towards the middle of this particular map, it's all the areas that are in the green going all the way over to the orange and to the yellow. Those are the non-Christianized areas. Either there's completely unreached people groups within those locations, or there's a very small minority of Christians most likely being persecuted. When I started missions, we always called this the 1040 window. Now we have different ways of describing it. But the bottom line is, when you look at that compared to when I started, you might sense that there's not much change. In fact, you might feel like, okay, yes, you can look at China and how the gospel is expanding there, but when you look at the Middle East, when you look at Syria and Iraq and Iran and what ISIS is doing to the Christians that are there, it really could leave you pretty pessimistic. It could leave you feeling like we're actually losing ground. And that same pessimism applies to Europe, no doubt. Those of you who are Europeans realize that if it's not the nominalism of the church that you're dealing with, it's this huge influx of people. So Europe, able to stand against the Islamic Jihad, is basically being taken over slowly just by immigration. And Muslims moving into that area and taking over areas of Europe. And so a lot of people are pessimistic about Europe now. They're pessimistic about America because we have this huge moral slide in the church. That's something else that unfortunately I've been able to witness over 20 years, is the moral decline, the continual separation of church and state that just is leading us to issues of homosexuality and transgender and the violence and school shootings. Go on and on and on and on. You look at the financial world, and you could get pretty pessimistic about your future. People are telling you if you're an American, you will never see your Social Security. You'll never get that. There's no way the government will have that money. The American government's trillions of dollars in debt. Financial collapse started to happen in 2010. If you look at Europe, there are countries that are bankrupt. Think about that. Whole countries that are bankrupt and trying to fight their way out of bankruptcy. So the financial world doesn't give you a whole lot of reason to be optimistic. Now, as I said, I'm a missionary in Taiwan. This is our 5th year that we've been there. And the gospel, missionaries have been coming to Taiwan for quite some time. Starting with the traders, European traders, settlements in the 1600s, 1700s. However, they were never able to establish a large church in Taiwan. It was always kind of small. It was mostly Roman Catholic. It was around the port areas. And then in the 1800s, the Presbyterians started sending missionaries towards the end of the 1800s. And one of the most famous is this man, George Mackay. If you've been to Taiwan, I know some of you did your SBS there, you can see that Lovely looking man there. That's his head. It's really large. Fun to take pictures next to. That's in the old street, the old part of Taiwan. And then they literally have this, this monument here of his boat, and there he is kneeling and praying where they believe he basically landed sometime around the 1870s. He established the first hospital in Taiwan. He established the first university in Taiwan. He pulled thousands of teeth. Okay, that's kind of random, but that was how he started to minister and open people up to the gospel. Of course, you can see what's right behind George Mackay. Yes, Starbucks. I wish we could somehow package the gospel with Starbucks. Starbucks has been way more influential and successful in Asia than Christianity has been in some of these countries. If we could somehow get a latte gospel or a macchiato Holy Spirit thing going. All those who love Starbucks said, amen. Okay, so George Mackay came and he had some impact, started to establish some of the Presbyterian churches. But again, the Japanese came over, they took control of Taiwan, and the church stayed extremely, extremely small during this time period. In fact, again, it shrank somewhat. 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government are defeated by Mao Zedong and the communists, and so they have to escape. He brings with him about 2 million people, and along with him come most of the foreign missionaries, because Mao Zedong and the communists did not want any foreigners. They did not, again, appreciate Christianity, and so they were pushing it out. And so these missionaries came to Taiwan, and then because of Chiang Kai-shek's need for Western support, for Allied support in order just to survive against the communists, he was forced to allow more and more missionaries to come into Taiwan. So from 1950 until about 2000, we're talking about, for a small geographic area, for a small population, even today Taiwan only has about 23 million people, this little island nation was pounded with missionaries. SEND, OMF, IMB, YWAM. I mean, they all were sending missionaries, starting Bible schools and churches and doing all different types of ministry. And yet today in 2015, Taiwan is still about 4% Christian. 4% Christian, and most of those Christians are all centered in the northern part around the capital of Taipei. That's where the church is strong. It's probably actually like 5 or 6%, and it's pulling the rest of the percentage of the country up. As you go south, the number of Christians drops significantly. In the city that I live in Taichung, about 1.2 million people in the actual city, about a little bit over 2 million in the surrounding kind of county area. It's about 2% Christian. And so I have to ask myself that question. That if missionaries like George Mackay and others have been coming here for hundreds of years, all these organizations have been sending missionaries and trying to start Bible schools that, to be honest, a lot of them are just empty. You just drive by them. They're up on a hill and you're like, what's that building? Oh, that was a Bible college that IMB started. They had to shut it down because they don't have any students. The largest seminary in Taichung, in my city, has less than 50 students now. And you look at that and of course you're pessimistic. Of course you're thinking, what am I doing? And a lot of the missionary organizations have done that. They have looked at the situation and said, this is a misallocation of resources. The people of Taiwan are not responsive to the gospel, so let's send our missionaries somewhere where people are. Let's send them to mainland China, let's send them to Cambodia, let's send them to other places. And so a lot of organizations are stopping sending any new missionaries. And so the missionaries of Taiwan are literally dying off, because they're just the older people that they won't take out of that assignment because they've been there for their whole lives, basically. So what do we do with this? What do we do as we look out at our world and our generation is highly pessimistic, talking about Christian or non-Christian alike? And we look at the expansion of the gospel and we look at what's happening in the Middle East, or if you're like me and you're in a country, if you're in a place like Japan or Thailand where just wave after wave of missionaries have been broken upon the shores of Hinduism and Taoism and ancestor worship. How can we be optimistic? What are you guys doing here in YWAM? Some of you who feel called to Asia or called to the Middle East. Well, this is where I hope that the book of Joshua can give you faith. that the book of Joshua can instill in you a sense of optimism, a sense of what our God is able to do when we step out in obedience and in faith and we follow Him and His guidance and His direction. I mean, that is the incredible uniqueness of the book of Joshua that we're going to be looking at over the next 2 days. They were a faithful, obedient generation. And let me tell you what, you better enjoy it in the book of Joshua because it's not going to last. Right? It really will not last. You maybe see a few bright spots with a few generations in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, but overall, it's just a sad tale from here on out to the exiles, 722 BC and 586 BC. But for this generation, okay, for this generation, they followed God. They were radical about holiness. They had faith. They were courageous. And they were able to do amazing things. As we look through this book, you think about, okay, this is the second generation that has come out of Egypt. The first generation, spiritually, not so good. Right? The golden calf, that's how they kicked it off. Not maybe the most auspicious of beginnings. They follow that up with whining, complaining, to the point where God sends plagues and there's literally like birds and bird meat coming out of their noses. That's not good. Plagues, the ground opens up, swallows them. They rebel against Moses. They rebel against God. They want to go back to Egypt where there was really good liver. I always think that's kind of funny. Let us go back to Egypt and there was really good liver and leeks and onions. Okay, I guess they were really yummy. So it was a horrible generation spiritually. In fact, they fell back in disbelief and they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years. They were not lost. I'm very bad with directions. I could probably get lost in the wilderness for 40 years. They were trapped. They were under the judgment of the Lord. So when we say wilderness wanderings, they weren't just on a little, trip with the family, right? Packing up in the station wagon and seeing the sights of what we call Saudi Arabia today. No, they were trapped there because they were disobedient. And yet Joshua's generation, with the exception of the defeat at Ai and one family's sin, Achan's family's sin, there is no major judgment in this generation. We read from Joshua, again, even the end of Numbers, we read through Deuteronomy, there is no major judgment that happens. Just this one defeat at Ai, and they deal with it very quickly. I mean, that is incredible that a generation could see that. How about militarily, what are they able to do? Well, as we read through chapter 12, it might be the chapter where you're like, oh, great, I can't pronounce all these stupid names of places, names of kings, all right? So you just kind of try to read through it in your afternoon small group as fast as possible, right? And Jerusalem and Gezer and this place and that place and blah, blah. And maybe if I just pronounce it really quick, no one will notice. I have no idea how to pronounce this. But if we step back and we see the reason that list is there in chapter 12, it's because we are thinking about God giving them victory over every major military power in this whole area of Canaan. Every city God helped them to take. He helped them to take Jerusalem. He helped them to take Hatzor. He helped them to take Jericho. He helped them to take Ai. He helped them to take Bethel. He helped them to take Arad. All these major cities. We're just talking about each one of them was a city-state. Each one of them had a king. Each one of them had their own military. Each one of them had hired mercenaries. And God gives them victory every single time. In the whole book, one defeat. One battle that they lose, they win every single other battle. That's just unheard of in warfare. You just don't ever see that, and you won't really see that again in other generations necessarily, even of Israel. I mean, the miracles that these people were able to see. The priests lead the Ark of the Covenant. They step foot, they think it's going to be a little squishy, into the River Jordan. The waters part for miles upstream. And they cross over on dry land, and it says the people's heart, the Canaanites' hearts, began to melt because the fear of the Lord was being instilled in them. It said just like the spirit of them just went out. It's like, dang it. It's that same God who parted the Red Sea, and now He's parting our waters as well. I mean, they shouted, and walls fell down. That'd be pretty cool. I don't know about you, but that would be pretty nice to see. You just go up there. They didn't fire an arrow. They didn't sling a stone. They just shouted really loud. We do that a lot in YWAM. Okay? And it feels like sometimes our old rickety YWAM structures are going to fall down, but this was the largest, most fortified city of Canaan at this time. An ancient city whose history goes all the way back to 7000 BC. I mean, so this was just unheard of, incredible. The walls fell down. They're in a battle, and the sunlight is fading, and Joshua wants to finish the job. He commands the sun and the moon to stop in the sky, and it stops. Right? Sun, moon, stop. Boom, whole day stops. I mean, that's the kind of miraculous power. That's the kind of victory. That's the kind of land, the kind of advancement that the kingdom of God can take when His people have faith, when His people have courage, and when His people are obedient. And this is the witness that it was to the generations of Israel, and this is the witness that it is to us today. Because we either believe that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, or we don't. We either believe that if we follow these principles that God has set out in His Word, we will have success and victory and see the church advanced and see all these false, again, idols torn down, or we don't. So as you read through Joshua, I hope that it gives you a sense of optimism about what is possible when we follow God. And as we look at Joshua and his generation, we're going to ask that question, okay, what were the keys to them being a successful people? Well, of course, we've mentioned faith, and we love the stories of faith. Okay? We love hearing about them today and YWAM, the great financial faith stories where God tells someone, hey, you're going to go on a trip, and they say, I don't have any money. So they go to God says, well, just go to the airport. They're like, I don't even have a ticket. I don't have any money. That's stupid. They go to the airport. They meet someone who has an envelope that has the exact kind of money, right, that they need for the ticket. And we're like, yay, we love those stories. Joshua is full of them. Right? They followed God's strategy and God's guidance in the book. Even when some of those strategies of God seem pretty stupid. I'm just going to say it. They don't seem intelligent or wise at all. But they are so convinced that God knows the way, that God can do the impossible, that they'll do what He tells them to do, and it works. And so we in YWAM, of course, we love those stories because we talk about hearing the voice of God, and we're not just making that up, it's in Scripture. God's people seeking Him out, taking time to pray and say, God, how do we take Jericho? God, how do we take the land? God, how do we settle the land? And God gives them these strategies that they enact. And we love those stories. And then the third main reason that they're successful is because they were radical about holiness. Radical about obeying the covenant of God. When they get into the land, after they take Jericho, one of the first things they do is they go to these two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, and they renew the covenant just like they just did on the plains of Moab in the book of Deuteronomy. I mean, they are serious. So serious, there's almost a civil war at the end of the book because some of the tribes are not following one obscure law to them. And there's almost a civil war. So as we look through the book, we're like, yay, faith stories, yay, guidance stories. And then we read the holiness stories and we're like, ugh. Okay, that's where the wheels fall off for most of our generations. We are not excited or passionate about holiness. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the book of Judges, another generation of gods that we're not excited about holiness, but we really aren't. And we struggle with, every year I teach in SBS or DBS or BCC or whatever. If we study the book of Joshua, we get to the chapter on Achan. And I know students are going to be angry about it. They're going to have a lot of questions. They're like, okay, how, why? I mean, he made a mistake. Where's grace? How come? And what about his poor animals? Why are we stoning donkeys to death? Like, how does this make any sense? But it's an example of how radical they were in following God and raising the standard higher and higher. And I think this is probably going to be, for our generation, the one that's going to be the most difficult. to teach, for us to follow, because it's just not the current trend in Western Christianity. All right, so our plan for this morning is we need to first talk about the big picture of the book. This is a lot of the stuff that you are assigned in your homework, and so I want to walk you through that as well. I know you don't have as much time in Joshua, so we'll walk through the big picture of the book, very similar to the structure that you have in your Nelson Bible handbook. We'll talk about the dating, kind of the main idea, main reason written, the setting of the book. And then once we're finished with establishing that, we're going to move on. And the way that we're going to go through this book is just going through what are the major keys or the major reasons that this generation was so successful. And the whole point of that is that with each of those keys, once we look at what it means in Joshua, we're going to say, okay, how can we walk this out? Like, we want to be a Joshua generation. We want to see that kind of success in whatever ministry, whatever nation God is calling us to, whatever churches that we're leading, whatever businesses He calls us to create. This is the kind of success we want. So let's see how they were able to do it. There's some more specifics than just the big three that I gave you. All right, so where Deuteronomy left us, let's kind of place this back in the flowing narrative of God's redemptive history that's happening. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we were here. This is the plains of Moab, looking down towards the Jordan Rift Valley, where the Israelites are camped out. The first generation have all died out, with the exception of Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. They fell back in disbelief. They were not allowed to cross over into the Promised Land. Even Moses himself knows that he is not going to be allowed to cross into the land, because he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Again, hopefully you covered that passage already, but he knows he can't do it. And so he's got to commission Joshua as the man who's going to lead the conquest, who's going to help them cross the river and go into the land. But it's not just about the military preparations. Deuteronomy says the most important preparation that they needed to make was, again, agreeing to follow God's covenant. That the first generation at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19 and on had said, yes, we will, and then did not. Right? And so now this second generation, those who have been wandering around the wilderness or born in the wilderness, God has to put the same question. He says, you choose today. You choose life, which means obedience to the covenant and blessing, or you can choose death, which is from the curses and the disobedience. Pretty easy choice to me. However, it comes at a high cost. And Deuteronomy reminded them of all that cost, from the 10 Commandments to the rest of the laws. In fact, someone has counted, and there's a little dispute whether there's about 606 or 612 laws from Exodus to the end of Deuteronomy. So there is a cost, right? There is a standard. It's not just kind of a vague, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor and just figure the rest out. No, there's some specifics, even when it comes down to their clothing choices, right? Of representing the holiness of God. But the people say, I will follow him. And so now God believes, now you're ready. Moses dies, his body disappears, that's kind of weird. And they're ready to finally cross into the land. And how long have they been waiting to take the land? Okay, 40 years? Well, this generation, but how long has Israel been waiting? 400 years, right? The whole time they were slaves in Egypt. Right? They saw obviously no fulfillment of God's promises. They've been waiting for a long time to see this happen since God promised it to Abraham. And now that time is finally here. So that's what's recorded in Joshua, the big picture of the book. We're just going to kind of walk through it here for the next few minutes. Chapters 1 through 5, and just to let you know, towards the end of the week, I will give the PowerPoint to the staff, and they can send it out to you guys. I do that just because I know, especially second language students and everybody, it's hard to be typing this fast. And then you get people today, I think this is hilarious, they'll pull out their cell phones and actually take pictures of the PowerPoint. I'm like, this is weird. 20 years ago, we had overhead projectors, I was setting my keys on it so the wind wouldn't blow it away. So we will give that out, and hopefully that allows you to take your own notes, right, and be able to really absorb and follow through. So chapters 1 through 5, they're just preparing to go into the land. Joshua is commissioned in chapter 1. God gives him his marching orders, so to speak. And then in chapter 2 through 3, they send the spies into Jericho. That's going to be the first major city. That's going to be, really, if they can't crack that open, the whole strategy of the campaign falls apart. So they send the spies in. Rahab brings them in and enters into the whole redemptive narrative of God, as she will be in the line of David, which means that she'll be in the line of Jesus. Once they cross into the river, we talked about the miracle. God parts the Jordan, sign really of confirmation for the people. It builds their faith and it melts the faith of the people in the land. Then God calls them to do something rather odd. We're going to talk about it later. He says, this is the perfect opportunity to circumcise all the men who weren't circumcised before. And then they celebrate their circumcision with the Passover. So it's just kind of odd, and we're going to talk about that. Once they're circumcised and celebrated Passover, then the true conquest of the land begins. And from chapters 6 through 12, that's what is taking place. Now 6 through 12, we find out later, is about a 5-year span. So this whole conquest, the central, then the south and the north, takes about 5 years for this whole military campaign. I mean, as you're reading through in the chapters, it seems like it's just a couple of days or something, but it's 5 years. Obviously, the author's being highly selective. Now, in those campaigns, as I said, you got to think geographically. So in your Nelson book, it's great because it has all these maps, and you can think about, okay, how they come in. If you're not familiar with Israel, you're not familiar with where these locations are, I highly recommend take a look at the map, because what you'll find is that there's a central campaign in chapters 6 through 9. So they take Jericho, that's pretty much right in the center of the country. After Jericho, they clean out the hill country there in the middle, Bethel and Ai, and then they were going to move on to another area, probably the south, but the Gibeonites trick them into an alliance, and the Gibeonites are attacked and they're forced to go and defend Gibeon. And that finishes up the central campaign in chapters 8 and 9. Once they're finished, chapter 10, they turn their attention down to the south. The main city there was Hebron and Arad. And so they clear out those major cities, defeat those kings. Chapter 11, they finish things up in the north. In the north, they're able to kind of do things a little quicker because the northern kings help them out by all getting together in one area. They think they're going to be smart, and they make this huge alliance. And basically all they're doing is making it a lot easier for God. He's like, just get a little closer, closer, bam! And then they're all dead. Sun and moon stop in the sky, right? And we talked about that. Chapter 12 is just a summary. It's the highlight reel of the end of the season, and all the slam dunks and all the three-pointers and all the things that they were able to do are on this highlight reel, this kind of chapter 11 of Hebrews kind of record of faith of what they were able to do when they believed in God and followed His covenant. So here's a map just to kind of give us that general idea. They were over here on the plains of Moab, and then they crossed right just above the Dead Sea was the city of Jericho on the western bank, which is why it's still called today the West Bank, right? So it's on the western bank of the River Jordan. So they take Jericho, they clean out this hill country, turn their operations to the south, mop up all that, and then again finish up towards the north. Now, anyone who's followed political science or history or warfare know that defeating the military is just the first step to taking a country. Once you've actually defeated all the military, now you have to have the mop-up crew. You have to go city by city and clear all the regions out. You clear the rest of the city out, you clear the rest of the region out, you deal with the smaller tribes and clans. And so what God instructs them to do is, instead of doing that as a group, He's going to break up the land into their eventual allotments, the land allotments. And then each individual tribe is responsible to go back and clear out that land, dispossess the rest of the Canaanites in there, and establish their own settlements. And that's what starts in the rest of the book. Chapter 13 through 21, I know it will be all of your favorite parts of Joshua. Yes. Yeah, because if you thought the city names were difficult in chapter 12, it gets even worse, because it just goes from city to city to city, city to city to city. Again, if you're not following a map, it's pointless to read these chapters. If you don't have a map out in front of you of the tribal allotments, it really won't mean anything. So I encourage you, maybe as you're reading through it, bring your Nelson books with you and just have the map. so that you can kind of look at it, read through the city names, and you can kind of see where each of these tribes were in the land allotments. Now the 2.5 tribes, right? The 2.5 tribes already got their land allotment. That was back in the book of Numbers. So half of Manasseh, which is also half of the tribe of Joseph, getting more confusing. Gad and Reuben, remember they settle on the east bank. After they defeat Sihon and Og, the king of the Amorites, they go, hey, it's pretty nice over on this side of the river. We're good, right? And Moses says, okay, you can have this part, but you're not getting out of the rest of the conquest, right? In fact, you're going to serve at the front. You are going to be the vanguard. And so the women and children of Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad go, see ya, suckers, right? Hopefully they get their men back because they're serving at the front. We know they pretty much got them all back because in the whole time of the conquest, how many deaths were there? 86? Okay, how many died at Ai? It's 36. That's the only time we read of any of the Israelites losing people in a battle during the conquest. I mean, again, that's just unheard of, incredible, miraculous, add all your own words, only losing 36 people. So they've already got their settlement on this side, and so from 13 to 17, they do one tribal allotment at the city of Gilgal, and they choose their allotments, and Caleb gets his special plot of land. He's a spry old geezer, right? He's like, I'm 85 years old, I'm ready to kick butt, right? That's what he basically says. I've never been stronger. I hope I can say that at 85, because at 43, I don't feel as good as I did when I was your guys' age. My hair is departing to the great beyond, you know, I'm bending over more, right? So whatever Caleb was eating, drinking, the Caleb lifestyle was good. So he's 85, and he says, give me the hardest country with the tallest people, the Anakites, and he goes and clears that out. It's a great start because as we continue to read through the rest of the allotments, the author or someone edits it in and adds a few little notes that preview Judges. Like, and unfortunately, Judah didn't really drive the people out of Jerusalem, the Jebusites, so they live there to this day. And then Manasseh kind of left a few of the Canaanites in their territory, and they're there to this day. So he's giving us a little preview of what the successive generations will fail at, which is to complete the job, to complete the settlement and dispossess the rest of the people out of the land. Simeon kind of gets a little bit of the shaft, I always think, because it gets its allotment inside of Judah, and Judah basically absorbs it. They kind of become part of Judah. And even in a sense, Benjamin, technically Jerusalem is in Benjamin. It's the saddle. It's called the saddle. It's kind of this high country area. And it eventually kind of gets absorbed into part of Judah as well. They're still mentioned separately, but they're always mentioned together, and Judah is where the Davidic dynasty will be. They're going to be the leadership and the eventual monarchy of the south. If you look up north, you see Dan over there gets a really nice piece of property by the ocean. And unfortunately, the pesky people groups who live there don't really want to give it up. And Dan doesn't really want to fight for it. They're like, this is just too hard. So in the book of Judges, we're going to hear about the lovely story of how Dan decides, I know God gave us this land, but let's just go choose an easier place. And that'll work out for us. So they keep going up north. Ephraim's like, hey, get out of here, losers. This is our land. Manasseh says, keep going. Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali. They have to go all the way up. And you see at the very top, probably can't read it from there, it says Dan. It has a city name that says Dan on it at the very top. It's like the northernmost city of Israel. And in fact, later when the book of Kings and Samuel is trying to describe Israel, and it wants to say from north to south, everyone did blah, 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 blah. They'll say from Dan all the way down to Beersheba, which is down in the wilderness of Judah. But that city wasn't always called Dan. In fact, at one time, there was a lovely, peaceful people group there, and the city was called Laish. It says they were a peaceful people, minding their own business, not in the allotted promised land of God. And the Danites go up there and go, perfect. And they wipe them out. Just wipe the city off the face of the planet, and that becomes Dan up there. So that other land is never taken which is really convenient for the Philistines, because when they arrive, they pretty much choose that area of land, and you can see it down below. So this map says Philistia. They weren't there yet. They don't arrive until the book of Judges, depending on what Bible seminary you go to. All right. So once the allotments, the division of the land is finished, then the last few chapters are kind of the end of this radical generation. And the reason I titled it that is that 22, if you recall, I mentioned, is the almost civil war. That they literally almost go to civil war because the 2.5 tribes on the east bank erect an altar, a memorial, so that the other tribes on the west bank won't forget about them. And that is breaking the commandment of God in Deuteronomy 12. So they almost go to war until Phineas steps in and goes, hey, we need to do a little conflict resolution. They resolve it, probably tear the altar back down, and it's okay. In 23 and 24 is just a really long death sequence. Right? Joshua is about to die, and you're like, come on, just die already. Keep saying it. Joshua is really old, and he's about to die. And Joshua is still really old and still really about to die. And he wants to make sure that he hands it off to the next generation, the third generation, that they complete the job, that they continue to walk in obedience and courage and faith. And so they renew the covenant once again, and he gives his great speech. And in his great speech is one of the most famous verses out of Joshua that we stencil onto pencils and put on our walls. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And it's his radical statement of what his whole life was about and what he is commanding the next generation to do. And then he dies at 110 years old. All right, so that's the big picture. Any questions up to this point?
Why
Yes.
did Dan move all the way to the north again?
Okay, why did Dan move all the way to the north? Because the people that were in their tribal allotment were too tough. They said they've got chariots, they've got way too many people in their army. We can't take it.
You think that was lack of faith?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if they can shout and walls fall down, what's a chariot? I mean, Deborah doesn't mind chariots. In Judges, she goes out and is commanding the battle along with Barak, and God takes care of one of the largest chariot armies that the area of Canaan ever had seen. So yeah, I think it's a total lack of faith.
So they had been at the extreme south and then went to the extreme north.
Yeah, well, they were kind of basically in the middle there. They're in the middle. Judah is the extreme south. So they were in kind of the middle of the country. They went all the way north and found the most peaceful group of hippies they could find and wipe them out. Now, when we get to Judges, and when you read the story, Judges is going to expand this. And it's a little odd because it's at the end of the book of Judges. Right? So the story of how Dan goes up north is at the end of the book. It doesn't start until Judges 17. It's out of chronological order. You need to realize the two stories at the end of Judges are out of chronological order. They're stories from this third generation, the third generation after Joshua. And we'll talk about why they're out of order when we look at Judges on Wednesday and Thursday. All right, so that's the tribal allotments. All right, so what's the main information? What is God really trying to communicate in this book of Joshua? Well, what I want to hopefully challenge you with is something that I would imagine your staff has already told you. Your main idea, especially in the Old Testament narratives, should have something about God in it. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that God is actually the main character from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Maybe I'm stretching things, but I really believe that, yes, we're going to talk a lot about Joshua and his generation, and they were awesome. But God is the awesomer character of the book of Joshua. Without God, there is no Joshua. Without God, the walls don't fall down. Without God, there is no conquest. Without God, there are no promises. And so even though, as we said, this promise happened a long time ago. Remember, the promises start in Genesis 12. God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you descendants. I will bless those who bless you, and in all the families of the earth will be blessed in you. Then in chapter 15, God renews the covenant with him again and actually seals the covenant. In the Old Testament Hebrew, when they talk about sealing a covenant or making a covenant, the Hebrew verb is actually to cut. you cut a covenant with someone. And that's because the way that you sealed a covenant back then is you literally cut an animal in half. And God does this himself in chapter 15 of Genesis. And it's really kind of a weird story because we don't understand the culture. But the point is that if I break this covenant, may the same thing be done to me that was done to this animal. May I literally be cut in half. So God seals that covenant in Genesis 15 and then gives the specifics of the land. God says that all the way, really, from the northernmost mountain of Canaan, of Palestine, all the way down to the Wadi of Egypt, from the Mediterranean all the way over to the Tigris and the Euphrates, I will give this land to my people. I, the Lord, say this. It's a I will. It's an unconditional statement. And even though it takes a long time, I mean, for us, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine waiting 400 years for God to fulfill a promise. I would imagine after 100 years, they're like, nah, that's never going to happen. 200 years, who even remembers it? 300 years, I mean, you've moved on. Right? We wait for a couple of months for God to fulfill something to us, and we're like, God, where are you in my life? Right? You promised me you're going to supply my every need for outreach, and it's not here yet. And you said you're going to release me in ministry, and I'm still training. I'm still doing this dumb DBS. Where's my ministry? And these people waited 400 years, but God is faithful. If God promises, if he says, I will, then he will, in his timing. And so this was his timing. He's faithful, and he gives them the whole land. In Joshua chapter 11, in verse 43, and then in chapter 21, there's this great kind of one-verse statement about this, that God gave them all the land that he had promised to their ancestors, all of it. Now it was just their job to stay in the land and to finish the settlement of it. Now, if we just look at Joshua and the people, then I believe this is the main idea, the main thing that's being communicated. It's a pretty simple formula, and it is obedience and faith bring victory and blessing. It really doesn't change throughout Samuel, throughout Kings, throughout Chronicles, all the recorded history, Ezra, Nehemiah. Anytime God's people are willing to follow this formula, they're willing to obey God and have faith, there is victory and blessing. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that they don't lose some people, that there isn't persecution from the enemy. But ultimately, God's will is done, and ultimately his kingdom advances, and people learn about him. Right, now, why was this put together? As I have hinted, and if you've already read further than Joshua, you understand that the successive generations fail miserably. I mean, for Judges, we're talking about 300 years of failure. They turn to idolatry, and then God gives them over to their enemies to try to cause them to repent, and they just go through cycle after cycle of sin and backsliding, and I mean, it just is horrible all the way up to the time of Samuel. And so when this book was edited together, the thought is that we need to convince each generation that this is possible, no matter how bad the generation is before you. And we talked about it with this particular generation. The generation before, the generation of Moses and Aaron, was not good, other than a few people. It doesn't really matter, because if you as a generation are willing to turn to God and obey and have faith, then you can see blessing and obedience. And so I believe that Joshua was first edited together to try to communicate that. And there are generations that listen. Praise the Lord. David's generation listens. Jehoshaphat's, Hezekiah's, Josiah. Some of these guys that you're going to get to read about in the book of Samuel and Kings. They walk it out. And you see massive reform, you see massive revival, and you see military victories just like you see in this book. Ridiculous military victories where Jehoshaphat goes out to battle against 3 different armies coming against him, and God says, send the worship team first. Right? And the worship team's like, I don't like that plan. Can we vote on this? So they're going out with their drums and their harps and all that stuff. And I mean, and they still win the battle. Without even having to swing a sword, God allows them to win the battle. So there are generations that do walk this out, and they see crazy victories in the face of defeat. As well, this is also in general true of Genesis all the way through Esther, that it's a record from God's perspective of his redemptive history. And God wanted there to be a witness from Genesis all the way through to Esther of what he was doing and why. And when you think about the section of literature that you're in, okay, you just finished, again, the books of Moses. Sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, right? Penta meaning 5. Sometimes this is referred to as just the law, Torah, right? Sometimes law is just 5 books, sometimes it's just laws, sometimes it's the Old Testament. So different names, we just call it the books of Moses. You're finished with that. Contains the core of the covenant. Now you're entering into a section of the Hebrew Bible called the former prophets. And since there's former prophets, that means we have to have latter prophets. And then, of course, there's the section of the writings. And these were the major categories of the Hebrew Bible, what we call now the Old Testament as Christians. So how does Joshua qualify as a prophet? In fact, the former prophets are Joshua to 2 Kings. And then the latter prophets are when we actually think the prophets start. And that's Isaiah, the other 3 major prophets, and the 12 minor prophets that fit on one scroll. And then, of course, the writings, we're going to start looking at, you've already started that. You looked at the book of Job, right, in the first week. And we're going to do Psalms at the end of this week. So how does Joshua through Kings qualify as prophets? Right? Well, this has to do with our sense or understanding of what prophecy is. Now, if you're like me, before I did SBS and I thought of prophecy, I thought of one word: future. Right? Prophecy is something about the future. It's a prediction. That's kind of my New Testament understanding of it. However, once you read through the whole Old Testament, particularly you read through the prophets, Isaiah through the minor prophets, and you'll see that prophecy is really about God's perspective on time. And sometimes, yes, that is the future, but a lot of places, Jeremiah, it's almost all about God's perspective of the present, of Jeremiah's present circumstances. And see, this is where we need just a little humility, because we think we read history and we understand it, because we read the facts. And then God says, you don't understand it at all. You're totally misreading why this event happened, and why I did this, or why I did that. And so, as God is leading his people from, again, Egypt and on, and even before that, he wants a record of the past from his perspective, so that we can see Joshua was successful, and this is why. The author will say it, why he's successful. And when Judges is not successful, the author will explain from God's perspective why they were not. So past, present, future is all part of prophecy. And so that's why these are called the prophets. Now I believe there's another reason, which is that I believe it's the prophets are the main ones who are recording this history God's way. So when we talk about authorship, we may not have a lot of specifics, but I do believe the prophets, sons of the prophets, are the ones that are writing this stuff down God's way. So I think this is the part that we're at generally. All right, let's do this thing with dating, and then we'll take our first break. Have you guys seen this mathematic formula before? Yes. Okay. Some people are like, yes. Staff are like, yes, definitely. Okay. When we talk about when these events took place, and we're trying to get when this book was actually written down or recorded, we always go back to this verse in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, because it's going to help us figure out Old Testament chronology. And what that verse tells us is that in the 4th year of Solomon, he started to build the temple. And based on a lot of details that we don't have time to go into, we know that the 4th year of Solomon was 966 BC. Now he says there's another importance about 966. It's the 480th year since the people of Israel came out of Egypt. So if we just do a little simple math, and that's about all I can do anymore, I can't even help my kids with their middle school math. If we can do some simple math, and remember in BC we go backwards, then we end up with a date for the Exodus, 1446. Now we can kind of throw in some of the rest of the Pentateuch that you've studied. Numbers tells us that they were again, judged and in the wilderness for 40 years. So we can subtract that out to get us to the beginning of Joshua. So Joshua chapter 1 is right around 1406, 1405 BC, because we've gone 40 years in. Now, remember when I talked about the old geezer, Caleb, in chapter 14? And he's talking about his life, and he says, again, he talks about he was 40 years old when he was a spy, and now he says, now I'm 85 years old. So if he's 40 years old as a spy, we add the 40 years for the wandering. That's how we get 5 years for the amount of time that the conquest took place. Is everybody with me? We're getting more complicated here. Carry the 3, divide by 2, pi is 3.1. Oh. Hopefully we're all there. All right, so 5-year conquest. Now at the end of the book, I said Joshua takes a few chapters to die, but eventually he does die. And he's really not even finished dying yet, because in the book of Judges, it has him dying 2 more times. It's like, well, it must have been really significant. So at this death sequence, it says that Joshua was 110 years old. And if we kind of guess that Joshua and Caleb are probably the same age, at least close, it makes sense because they were both chosen as tribal leaders to represent their tribe to go and spy out the land. So it makes sense that they were probably both considered of military age, of leadership age, probably both 40. That means that the last date in this book, or the last event, Joshua's death, must have taken place somewhere around 1375 BC. So when we talk about when was Joshua written, when was the book written, we know it has to be after 1375, right, because that's the last event that's recorded. Any questions up to this point? Now when we come back from break, I'm going to explain why do we even care? Okay? Other than just people who love timelines, who love dates, so that you can fill in the answer on your homework assignment so that you can go to the beach. Why do we care about all these numbers? What's the point? We're going to get to that when we come back. So let's take our break. Is this a bigger break?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, so let's take a 15-minute break, come back at 25 after, and we'll dive back in.
Give us coffee, just a few more minutes, it's almost done.